happening in your brain when you're on a psychedelic, especially something like psilocybin or MDMA, is that you have this concept going on called, it's rooted in the rebus model, which psychedelic scientists have come up with, which stands for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics.
Psilocybin, like I just mentioned, a macro dose put me in a position where I was able to, in literally a moment, view my mother and her relationship with me for what it was and forgive and move beyond.
I think it's a red flag if your guide or facilitator or whoever you are working with doesn't bring up conversations around consent before you go into a session.
The practical guidance you've provided here that people can note and take away and draw from is of huge value. I want to thank you for all that. The Webdelics podcast is back with another episode featuring Jennifer Chesak. This is going to be a really interesting one because the topic is moms on psychedelics. Jennifer, moms on psychedelics. I'm just trying to even think about my mother on psychedelics. I'm afraid to even contemplate it. I think that if she were still with us, she'd be mad at me even uttering those words together. How on earth did we come to a place in this world in which we're talking about moms on psychedelics?
Oh, that is such a great question. And first of all, thank you for having me on Webdelics, Scott. I really appreciate it. So happy to be here. But yeah, I think we've reached this place where it's entering the zeitgeist, the conversation of the conversation. It's in the culture that moms are on mushrooms, and they're doing this because they're sort of fed up with the way things are, and they're reaching for alternative options. And here we are.
There is a lot of stuff that is psychologically wrapped around the word mom. It's both fun, it's both joyful, it is intense, it is expectation heavy. People think about moms outside of media representations like moms dancing or moms cooking or moms hovering, all that sort of stuff. It's associated with caregiving. It's associated with nurturing. It's associated with creating the models that children see that they aspire to be, or that they learn about the world from and how to engage with the world from. Magic mushrooms, psychedelic experiences. It seems to me, and I have no doubt it is appearing this way to many other people, that there's a clash. How can a mother be a good role model? How can she set a tone for a family? How can she be a competent caregiver if she is taking a hallucinogenic?
That's such a good question. And I think that the answer lies in some of the terminology. We have to understand that many moms are actually doing what's called microdosing. And so microdosing is taking a very small amount of a psychedelic where you're actually not you're not impaired. You're not having you're not tripping, the classic tripping sensation of visuals and things like that. There are some benefits to microdosing, such as like reduced anxiety, being able to really engage with your kids a little bit more on their level, essentially. And so there's a difference between microdosing and then, of course, macrodosing, where macrodosing is more taking that really large amount where you actually are tripping and experiencing psychedelic effects. And of course, in that situation, you do not want to be responsible for caring for a child. That would be inappropriate. So we have to separate the two when we talk a lot about them. But both can be useful for parents, whether you're, no matter if you're a mom, a dad, whatever, it can be useful. And so if you were going to do a macrodose and do a large trip or journey, I would recommend doing that in a place where you are not having to care for children. Maybe your children aren't even, it would be even better if your children aren't even around in that space, because you just want to feel that you can focus on yourself, which is such a really important component, especially for moms. How often do moms really actually get to focus on themselves? Now, microdosing is something that you can do not daily, because there's like these schedules that you follow or protocols, and you can look those up, like the Fadiman protocol or Stamets stack, or some really common ones. There are some out there for women specifically. I'm working with a company right now called Mabel, so that's one to look up for women especially. But with microdosing, you're not going to have those psychedelic effects. You're still going to be able to care for your children. You can drive, that sort of thing, if you're doing a true microdose. So that's really important to understand. But yeah, I'm hoping that answers that initial question there, is that again, it's not this idea of that you are so impaired that you can't care for your children, but you might actually be able to care for them better. I'm not saying that's the only way to care for children is microdosing. Of course not. It's just a tool in a mom's arsenal, just like she might have a calendar system or whatever it is.
It is a very wide ranging and interesting, I will even say a little bit of a provocative answer to the question. And there are a lot of different directions that this conversation can go from it. And Jennifer, they certainly will.
Sounds good, Scott.
Let's start, though, with something that I realized I needed to get clarity on before going any further, which is, what is the exact set of problems that a mom might have that would warrant her to begin exploring either microdosing or macrodosing as a tool for her to use to be the best mom that she can be?
Absolutely. I think there are several things that are going on in a mom's life. And I am personally not a mom. And I just want to clarify that before we dig further into this conversation. I do have a lot of friends that are moms. I, love my own mom and things like that. And I recognize the challenges that women are facing today as mothers. A lot of times we are the primary caregiver, or, there, you may have a spouse that's part of that, but by and large, a lot of that emotional labor of caregiving does still fall to the mother in these heterosexual relationships. Of course, I don't want to speak in just heterosexual language, but if you're in a heterosexual language or a relationship, that can happen, where by and large women are responsible for a lot of things. And to sort of gauge some of that, I always ask this random question of like, who's responsible for all those like little mental things that most people aren't really thinking about? Like, when do you change your furnace filters? Like, that's in my brain, right? And when are your kids' pediatrician appointments? When are you taking the dog to the vet? Who does that labor by and large fall to? It's often the female in the relationship. And so moms have a huge burden. A lot of moms they have careers. They're working really hard in their careers at the same time. So balancing that can be really complicated. And we're all doing all these household things like, making sure the house is clean or picked up, or, just functional, making sure that people's lives run smoothly in the household. That often falls to the woman. And so lots of things going on there. At the same time, many moms right now are actually entering that perimenopausal stage, and that can add some complications too. So when you get into that middle age area, I'm 47, for example, so I'm feeling this. I'm not a mom, but you feel the stressors of daily life, and that could be compounded by being a mom. Also, you might be caring for aging parents. That's something that I'm doing. So you might be really sort of sandwiched there with all of these stressors at the same time that you're going through perimenopause, all these hormonal changes that are happening, and that can make you more susceptible to things like depression, anxiety, mood shifts, just stress in general. So there's just a lot going on in women's lives, especially if they are moms. And to compound all of that, you might have unresolved trauma. Now, it can be hard and complicated to resolve trauma in your life, But if we think back to our childhood, if we've had traumatic experiences in childhood, which are called ACEs for short, it's adverse childhood experiences in scientific literature, those things, so things like that could be anything from, more obvious things like abuse or neglect, but it could also be something like living through a natural disaster or a man-made one, or dealing with racism, systemic racism, or living through extreme poverty as a child. All of these things can really create adverse childhood experiences in us. And so we may have unresolved trauma, and then when we are adults and caring for children of our own or just living our lives, that trauma can still manifest in many different ways, and we can actually pass it down to our children. So I'm a really big advocate for, no matter where you are in your life, working on your trauma to help prevent passing that down. And I can talk more about how that gets passed down in a minute, but just kind of wanted to answer your question here initially, what the state of life is like for women and mothers today. So we want to be able to halt passing some of that trauma down to our children if possible, to halt these cycles of generational trauma. And I think psychedelics are a really great tool to do that. They're also a great tool for helping you through menopause. They're a great tool for just sort of engaging with your children a little bit differently. So we can talk about all those things.
I very much want to. I cannot help but think, as a man, when I'm hearing you talk about the stressors of being a mom, it sounds very intense, whether you have a career or not. But if you do have a career on top of it, particularly one that's high pressured or in which the family's finances are significantly related to your ability to pull in that money, you do have responsibilities for a lot of the day-to-day, I would say, household management and child care management, as well as perhaps elder care management responsibilities. And then maybe you are going through these medical changes. It is a little bit of a cliche to say that men don't always appreciate the stressors or the sheer amount of things pressing down on females that are operating within the modern work, professional, and home milieus that are fundamental to who and what we are as a society. But this really sort of laid that out in a way that I could understand and that made sense to me and really helped me put from a more empathetic place myself in the shoes of someone who could be serving all of these roles, a lot of which society doesn't necessarily ascribe a lot of pressure to, or doesn't admit that there is a lot of pressure associated with. When I first started the Webdelics podcast, Jennifer, I just have to be honest. Words like generational trauma, I was irritated even hearing them. I felt like they were these academic, woke sort of things that people were just saying to make themselves sound sad, all that sort of stuff. But I came to realize after interviewing and talking to people, and again, hearing it from someone like you, that this is actually something that's very serious and very real. It's not some sort of misty, woo-woo sort of concept. I used to work in the domestic violence space. The company that I worked for ran domestic violence shelters. And a lot of these women who had all of the responsibilities, including job responsibilities that you talk about, had to deal with additionally being mentally abused and in many cases physically abused. And their pets, by the way, were often abused too, which is another whole area of responsibility that I learned in that job women have to, by and large, take care of too. And animals can be demanding. And the children were observing the behaviors. The girls were observing their mothers being beat. The boys were observing their fathers abuse women. And a lot of work from a programmatic perspective had to be put into reprogramming the children so they wouldn't repeat these behaviors. And so when I think about generational trauma and you putting it the way you did, I can't help but really think through that experience again and understand behaviors that we learn, that we integrate into our own systems, can become what we repeat into others and then create new traumas upon those following us. And so, if you are someone in any of these circumstances, how do you, as a mom, psychologically get to the place where, okay, I know I have these issues. I know I need some sort of way to deal with the pressure so that I don't create generational trauma, so that I don't lose my mind myself, so that I can stay intact and in tune. But this is a drug. This is a drug, and people will think I'm a druggie if I start doing this. How do people bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean it's complicated, and we're still at that tricky intersection where we're still trying to reduce the stigma about psychedelics, of course, and it's not legal everywhere, so we have to acknowledge that as well.
Mhm.
So I will definitely dig into that, but I do want to back up and talk a little bit more about trauma and really make sure that people know that the trauma that they've experienced is not their fault, and how it's impacted your life is also not your fault. What happens is, and this is so surprising, but it really comes down to science, is what we've learned is that these adverse childhood experiences actually change your physical stress response, and you have a heightened stress response going forward. So something happens to you when you're 2 years old. We tend to think, oh, well, children are resilient, they'll get through that, and by the time they're adults, it won't be a big deal. But it actually really is, because it is physically changing your fight or flight response to a point where that fight or flight response is actually more ratcheted up.
Mm.
And so then you have trouble flipping the switch to the opposite system that you have, or it's part of the same system, but they kind of work in opposites. You have your fight or flight, and you have your rest and digest, which is when you feel really calm and your systems are functioning, you're digesting your food. If you've ever had that moment where you get into a fight or flight response and you throw up or you have diarrhea, that's because it shuts off the rest and digest, just to
Really?
give you an example. Yeah, I know people don't realize
Wow,
that,
I
but
never
we
knew that.
have tools where we can flip that switch ourselves, like meditation, yoga, deep breathing can help you flip that switch. But it's a really hard thing to do if you've had these adverse childhood experiences. And again, this is because of that altered stress response to the point where you tend to be what's called hypervigilant, where that stress response is turned on all the time. And so even when there aren't real threats around you, you tend to think that everything's a threat, and you're reactive and you're
Mhm.
emotional. And again, this is not your fault, but it is changing your stress response. And so, what we do know is that 1 in 6 adults has had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And it's more prevalent in women, or people assigned female at birth, to have that experience, to have had 4 or more ACEs. And so, when we've had 4 or more ACEs, our children are actually more than 3 times more likely to also have 4 or more ACEs, or to have adverse childhood experiences. And this is because we tend to pass down trauma in 2 ways. One is something that you just touched on by your experiences in working with domestic violence survivors, is that yes, there's some observations that are happening there, right? So
Yeah.
so if we grew up in a volatile household as children, that's our parenting model right there, right?
Yeah.
And so we may know better, but it's still ingrained in us to behave a certain way. And so we tend to have more volatile households ourselves then, because of how we were brought up. It's just a weird sort of environmental factor that happens. Now, psychedelics are a tool to be able to work on yourself in that way, lessen your reactivity, and then therefore halt that progression of passing down that generational trauma in some ways. Because what we do know is that psychedelics, or I'm sorry, what we do know about not passing down trauma is that what's protective against it, not a guarantee, but somewhat protective,
Mhm.
is if you can create a very calm, communicative household for your children. That is partially protective against passing the childhood trauma down. And so if we use psychedelics to do that as a tool, which I can dig into how that works, that is one way to foster that sort of really communicative, calm household. Now, the other way that we pass trauma down is just genetically. It's epigenetics. So when we experience trauma, we have that heightened stress response. It changes the way that our genes are actually expressed. And they've studied this in animal studies and human studies to see how that works. And they're fascinating studies. But anyway, what happens is we are more likely to pass that down epigenetically with just in our genetics. And so you can't do a whole lot about that. There's certain things, again, it's not guaranteed they're going to pass that down, but if we can work on ourselves a little bit, that can help to alter the way that we are and then help us protect our children from that. So those are two ways that trauma gets passed down, how it can impact people. But what we also know about psychedelics, just through research, is that yes, we have that heightened response from our adverse childhood experiences, but psychedelics, especially psilocybin, and I would say to a certain extent MDMA, I'm just more familiar with psilocybin, but psilocybin actually reduces that psychological response that we have to our adverse childhood experiences. And there's many mechanisms as to why, and I could definitely talk about those after a minute. But to get back to your question on, so that's the reason why I definitely I'm an advocate for psychedelics in the parenting space. Now, of course, you did bring up a really important topic, which is this idea of stigma. Like, how do we get past the idea of taking a drug that is considered illicit at this point?
Right.
To help us parent, right? And that's so complex. It's a really hard thing to navigate. There is a really great resource out there called Moms on Mushrooms, and that is run by a wonderful woman named Tracy T. I believe she lives in the Boulder area, but she's fostering a community of moms who are openly discussing their psilocybin use. And I think that helps to reduce that sense of stigma surrounding it, helps people become more familiar with the topic. So I encourage people to check her out on Instagram, especially. Her handle, I believe, is Moms on Mushrooms Official. So look for her. She's always got great reels. She's doing news content all the time and just sharing her wealth of knowledge. So that's one way to sort of help get over that stigma. And the other thing is just to sort of reshape how we think about that. Yes, psychedelics have had this weird history of where there was initially research in the 60s, 70s, and then that research got halted with the war on drugs. And now we have this research resurgence, which is really important. And we are learning how beneficial psychedelics may be. Of course, more research has to be done, but we can also look back to indigenous wisdom, which I think is really important anytime we talk about something like psilocybin, which is really rooted in that indigenous history. That's the only reason that we actually have psychedelics in the, in the United States or the Western world, that sort of thing. And so that indigenous wisdom is really important because historically, women in these indigenous communities have used psychedelics and to help them with. I mean, I'm not an expert on indigenous wisdom, but to help them parent and just to help them heal in general. So I think that's an important concept to consider. One more final note, and then I'll hand it back to you, so I'm not blabbing my mouth.
Please keep
But
going. This is great.
but I think it's also it's important again, to lean into that indigenous wisdom and think about that, but also to remember that right now we don't have widespread legality of psilocybin. So there is that fear, and I've heard moms talk about this, but there is this fear of, will someone report me for drug use, and yeah, that is a real concern. And so I would be careful to only talk about it in really safe spaces where you don't feel like someone's going to report on you. And then also just be aware of that and be private about it to a certain extent, especially if you live in a community where somebody would be more likely to report you, that sort of thing.
I'm really glad you raised that. So before I had this job in the domestic violence space, I also worked for years in the homeless service space, the homeless family service space in particular, not really single people, but families with children is what most of the work I was engaged with. And the reason why this is relevant to this conversation is that a lot of times mothers would allegedly want to, rather than go into a shelter system that they were scared of, they would prefer to spend the night with their children out on the street. Or if the shelter system turned them away, there was a concern that they would be spending the night with their children out on the street. And the position of the organization that I worked for was, I believe correctly, that a child sleeping out on the streets of New York City is a crisis that needed to be addressed immediately. And if it was one of those situations in which the mother was concerned about entering the shelter system, really, all that you needed to do was tell them if they did not get themselves and their children into the shelter system, ACS, the Administration for Children's Services, would be called. And the threat of losing a child, I have never heard of a single mother that continued to stand in her position in the face of that sort of threat. And so when you're talking about danger, again, that's just the people who we were dealing with may not be the same as those who are engaging in these communities that are talking about their psilocybin use. But nonetheless, if we're talking about the legality issues and how governmental entities, police officers, social workers may or may not view a mother engaging with this, the specter of children's services coming in and taking children away is something that has to be taken with the hugest degree of gravity, because that stuff can and will happen. And so I just want to thank you for no other reason in this show for raising that whole part of what you raised, because if for no other reason than to get that point out there. This is something that if you're going to be engaging in this or talking about it in a community that's hostile, this is not a line you want to cross. Or you may want to consider very seriously before crossing, I should say.
Yeah, and it's a really complicated situation, and I don't have the right answers because many women are turning to psychedelics to help them parent and be better parents. And so the idea that someone would say, "Oh, well, you're a druggie. I need to take your kids away," is really horrifying. Absolutely. And it just shows that there's still this really big disconnect in how people really understand what psychedelics are and are misunderstanding the benefits.
I could not agree more with that, Jennifer. It really goes as to the importance of conversations about this topic like the one that we're engaged in. It's why Webdelics exists. It's why people like you are out there. These outdated or these unconsidered paradigms about what people's behavior can really mean and how it could benefit or not benefit the welfare of their children, it really does need to go through some reconsideration. You also mentioned earlier, stepping back a little bit, that psychedelics, in particular psilocybin, is one of two ways that you can begin to address the pass down of generational trauma. I have been open from the very first episode of this series about my own childhood. It was very difficult. I had many more than 4 ACEs, and it was due to looking back on it with maturity and through a clearer lens that psilocybin helped me to be able to gather, due to a mother that was reacting, not entirely due to her, but in part due to her reacting to circumstances in the best way that she could, but that was itself heavily informed by trauma that she endured. I became one of those people who, as a teenager and adult, was hypervigilant. Anything would set me off. Heaven forbid you got in my way and got me angry. I couldn't even see straight. And it was great if there was an emergency, right? Like that reactiveness could help people, like on 9/11, when I was near the World Trade Center when they went down. That helped me gather people around me, grab their hands, and get them to be able to run when they were standing still. But on the other hand, day to day, That was a very, very bad thing. Psilocybin, like I just mentioned, a macro dose put me in a position where I was able to, in literally a moment, view my mother and her relationship with me for what it was and forgive and move beyond. Microdosing, on the other hand, as I've experienced it, is more of a heart opener, more of a creativity lifter, more of an empathy builder, more of heightening the experience. But I also felt more in touch with my emotions during that experience. And my fear hearing this, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it, is that, well, could the getting more in touch with your emotion, this increased sensory experience of life, actually cause someone to become more emotionally unfiltered, whether as a man or a woman, but as a parent, therefore potentially increasing the risks of these trauma responses in a family? Or is there a way that a mom who wants to actually use microdosing to decouple themselves from these overreactive or hypervigilant responses? Are there things you can do to minimize that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. So I think one of the things that I really advocate for, and I think is backed up by research to a certain extent, is that yes, microdosing can be a beneficial tool, but what's probably the more effective solution regarding psilocybin is to do a macro dose. So and then use microdosing after that to sort of continue to tap into what you learned on your bigger macro dose journey. So there are lots of things that are going on in the brain and body that are beneficial to help work on trauma during a macro dose. Then you take that experience, you integrate it, meaning you learn from it by doing some therapy, some journaling, meditating on it, that sort of thing. And then you maybe engage with a microdosing protocol going forward to help you kind of tap back into those sensations and the things that you learned during your macrodosing journey. So during a macrodose, you're going to have some increased neuroplasticity in your brain. That means you're growing new synapses and dendrites and all these. It's like your brain is blooming. It's like a garden in bloom, right? That's the way that I like to think about it. Yeah, and so after that time frame of macro dosing, you have this in even though you are no longer on the drug, you return to like your normal state of consciousness, that neuroplasticity continues for a while, has a lasting effect. But as researchers will say, and it kind of goes with other things, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? So you want to keep tapping into that increased neuroplasticity, and microdosing can help you do that. And I don't think there's a risk that microdosing alone, if you just went straight to microdosing, would increase your reactivity because, again, it does. It has a calming effect for most people, a very centering effect, increases your focus, that sort of thing, and maybe even helps you tap into that, like, that a hint of that childlike wonder and awe that we had as children that we kind of lose as we get into adulthood. I mean, yes, we can still have senses of childlike wonder here and there, but it's a little harder as an adult to get to that space. And microdosing just gives you that little edge to help you get there. And so I'm hearing from moms that they really enjoy getting down on the floor and playing like Legos or whatever it is with their kid when they're using a microdose. And they find that it's harder to do that when they're super stressed out and they don't have that little tool to help because they're worried about the dishes in the sink or like the laundry that's piling up or the fact that like, you know, they want to go and they have a deadline that they've got to do, but their kids are needing them and that sort of thing. And so when you are microdosing, it helps you relax. It helps you tamp down those daily stressors is my understanding of how moms are really using microdosing.
If my mom had been able to let down the place that she was in so often of stress and frustration and get down on the floor and play Legos with us, I would have had all my friends over hanging out all the time. I would have been the most popular kid in my neighborhood. But that being said, one thing that I'm imagining my own mom listening to this conversation or watching it on YouTube, that she may have been concerned about was that there is a risk, particularly if you are a female, of putting yourself in a vulnerable situation, particularly with a macro dose in which you do end up having to rely usually on a facilitator or a shaman or someone like that to help you with your set and your setting. And then also when you are in that hallucinogenic state, when you are having your trip, you're very vulnerable. And
You are.
a lot of the reason, if I were a female, that I would just find life stressful generally is just, you know, men like me are great, but there are also a lot of people out there that can use the vulnerability that their fellow human being may step into as an opportunity to be predatory or dangerous. And so, is that a concern that you hear from moms, and how do folks work around that?
Yeah, I hear that from just women in general thinking about doing a psychedelic journey, especially a macro dose, or engaging in like psychedelic assisted therapy or anything like that. Now, there are reports out there of nefarious people taking advantage of people. And a really great resource to sort of learn about that topic is there's a podcast that was put out by New York Magazine called Cover Story Power Trip. And it's like a several part series that digs into some of the issues that have happened. So you are correct in that a psychedelic puts you in a very vulnerable state, and you're open to suggestibility. And I'm going to back up and talk about that in just a second. And so, but you're also you're very vulnerable, and then you're open to suggestibility. And this is because of a model. Why are you open to suggestibility? I'll dig into that. And then I'll cover what we can do to make sure that we've got consent in place. Before going into a psychedelic session to outline all of those things. But what is happening in your brain when you're on a psychedelic, especially something like psilocybin or MDMA, is that you have this concept going on called it's rooted in the Rebus model, which psychedelic scientists have come up with, which stands for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. So what this means is that, so in a normal state of consciousness, like I'm in a normal state of consciousness right now. I don't know about you, Scott, but just
Oh, that was a
but if
point.
we
I
are
love
in a normal state of consciousness, our brains are super rigid, meaning it's hard to get new ideas into your brain during that time. When we are children, our brains are like super flexible because we haven't really formulated our identities yet, or we haven't really come up with how the world around us operates. We start to formulate that as we get into adulthood, but before that, our brains are super flexible. After that, they become super rigid in adulthood, and they can be really rigid in conditions where we have a history of trauma, so like PTSD. If you've got eating disorders, things like that, there's even more rigidity. And so it's really hard to change your mind about anything. So the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics comes into play when we think about then we're on a psychedelic. It actually makes our minds flexible again, almost like when we were children. And so a great way to think about that is imagine that in a normal state of consciousness, your brain is like a frozen pond. So it's ice. If you were to try to take a new belief, let's imagine you've got a rock that's a new belief, you're going to drop it on that pond. If it's frozen, that rock's not going to gain entry, right? It doesn't do anything. If you are on a psychedelic, now you've got water in that pond again. Now you take a rock, you drop it in, and it actually gets in there and it makes a nice ripple effect, has a lasting effect on the pond. So you're able to get a new belief into your brain, which can be a really great thing if you're trying to rethink some negative thoughts that you have. Maybe you have negative beliefs about your body image or whatever it might be. You can rewire that or rework that and get a new belief into your brain when you're on a psychedelic. And why does this happen? Why would our brains be so rigid in adulthood? It's because as we get into adulthood, our belief systems in our brain sort of formulate this hierarchy. And I always like to use this analogy of think about a corporation, and you've got your CEO beliefs at the top, they're controlling everything. And then you've got your like lesser important employees down here. So these other beliefs that you might want to climb up the ladder, the CEOs are like, nah, we don't want to listen to you. Go away, shut up. And so that can be a problem. But when you get on a psychedelic and you're doing like a deep journey, a therapeutic journey, that hierarchy goes away. All beliefs are equal. And And so one of those new beliefs that you're trying to get in there can gain a footing. Again, really beautiful if you've got something going on like an eating disorder, or you're dealing with trauma and you're trying to resolve that. These are beneficial effects. But now let's think about if we've got someone in the room with you, a facilitator, who's also a predator. Not so great, right? Because they can take advantage of that and try to get a belief into your brain, such as, hey, you want to have sex with me. And that's not what you wanted to do at all on your psychedelic. So I think that, and because obviously it's not sex, then that's rape, we all know that. So we need to be having really important conversations about consent before we go into a situation with any sort of facilitator, whether that is a guide that you find, or whether it's a psychedelic assisted therapist, anything like that. We need to be having conversations about consent. And so how I sort of help, or I encourage people to navigate that, is that I think it's a red flag if your guide or facilitator or whoever you are working with doesn't bring up conversations around consent before you go into a session. And what I mean about consent is really talking about what sort of touch is okay. So some people in a therapeutic setting like that, they may say, hey, yeah, like if something difficult comes up for me and I'm really struggling, I'm going to want you to hold my hand. Your facilitator needs to ask you about that before you ever get in the room with them on the psychedelic. That needs to be outlined. What are you comfortable with? What do you want? You may want absolutely no touch whatsoever, and that is your choice. And so your facilitator needs to outline those things with you first. Then, when you get into using the psychedelic with your facilitator, whoever that may be, that consent can't change. It can change in that you can revoke consent. Like maybe you said before you went into the session, you said, yes, I would like for you to hold my hand. Once you're in that session and something comes up for you, and your facilitator might be thinking, oh, now's the time they need hand holding, they need to ask you again. You can say, no, I don't want you to hold my hand. Um, or you can say yes, because you've already consented to that. Again, you can revoke consent, and you can revoke it at any time. What it can't happen is it can't go in the opposite direction. So if you said no outside of the session and you're like, don't touch me at all, they can't in the session then, when you're on the psychedelic, be like, you want me to pat your shoulder, right? Or rub your shoulders or something like that. Totally inappropriate. They cannot do that. You've already said, don't touch me, and they need to honor that. So I think if someone, what I'm saying is, like, if someone does not bring these conversations up with you before going into a session, I think that's a concern and a red flag. The other thing that can be beneficial too, and this is what I did, I worked with a male guide, and I went to a cabin in the woods. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, or like a horror movie is about to begin.
I'm imagining the monsters right now. The zombies.
Right. I worked with a male guide, and I was very concerned about that because of previous history and things like that. I was like, I really want to be safe. And he has female trip sitters that come along with him when he does facilitations, and so he actually, what was amazing is he brought his mom to be my trip sitter. She's experienced in that, but so I'm 47. I think I was 45 at the time or 44 at the time that I did my first journey. And he was 30 years old, and the mom was like 48 or something. So we were closer in age. And she came along and ended up like being my best friend on this trip, right? And I felt so safe and cared for because he did that. And I don't think I would have gone had he not had a female trip sitter there. Again, I fully vetted this guy before I went into this situation, but it was a really nice thing that he brought the female trip sitter and really made me feel extremely comfortable. And she was there just to be someone that I sat with during my journey. I could go off and do my own thing if I wanted or whatever. She was there if I was scared to go to the bathroom on my own. Some people are afraid to look in mirrors. So just those sorts of things. But it was also a somewhat fail-safe for me too, that like his mom is there. This guy's not going to assault me, right?
In front of his mom? Let's hope not.
Yeah, hopefully not, right? But so another thing to do is if you are considering working with someone, obviously check out any sort of reviews on their website or elsewhere. Ask different communities. So certainly in a community like Moms on Mushrooms, obviously Moms on Mushrooms is not going to like supply you with drugs or anything like that, but they will share resources in terms of, yeah, I worked with this facilitator and he was great or she was great or whatever. And so those resources can be of benefit to you to sort of help you vet a situation. Now, there was a platform that was in the works, and I don't know where it's at right now, but at the time that I was writing my book, um, there were two people that were creating kind of a website that it was like a system that rated people in like these flags, like this guy's a red flag or this person's a red flag, this one's a green light, you should feel safe with this person, and that sort of thing. And so just important considerations. And the same thing is true if you go out of the country for like a retreat, or in the country even, wherever you go. If you're going to retreat, ask how they handle consent. How do they work on that with other participants? Because you may not be the only participant in the room at a retreat, of course. And so you have the added risk of someone else on psychedelics, coming up to you and doing some unwanted touch. And so how do they navigate that? Do they have someone watching all the time to make sure that's not happening? Ask these things before you go into it. And I don't want to put the onus on women to like have to prevent their sexual assaults, because that's ridiculous. But, just being like logical in our thinking about how these, being aware of that vulnerability, and then what steps can you take to help mitigate it. Not that you can fully prevent it, no one can, but these are little steps that we can take.
Yeah, and the world is what it is, unfortunately. We have to accept that. And so the practical guidance you've provided here that people can note and take away and draw from is of huge value. I want to thank you for all that. One thing that was particularly impactful for me that you just said, by the way, was this brilliant description of the corporate hierarchy of ideas, and then the frozen lake, and dropping the rock into, it having had a pool of water within, all that sort of stuff. If there is this hierarchy of ideas that becomes less vertical and more horizontal during your psilocybin experience, one thing that I have heard some people express concerns about, and this may or may not be more acute with moms, but I suspect it might be more acute, is if I have a number of different ideas about what my social role is, or about what my expectations are with regards to caretaking of others, or my expectations are with regards to my relationship, or how I'm handling older parents, or estate management responsibilities, or downsizing, organize, all that sort of stuff. The fear that can come if those things are shifted around, that they could lead to rejiggering of relationships that can be very disruptive for the family. Like, let's say, during the past 10 years or so, I've been vaguely dissatisfied with my relationship. I think maybe I've settled with the husband that I'm in. I'm not quite happy. It's not going the way I want. I have these children by him. We're sort of sticking together. Now, with my hierarchy of ideas rejiggered, suddenly this idea called separating or divorce is taking on more prominence, or other things like that. And so I've heard people say, well, a lot of these changes I'm afraid of really engaging in because I'm afraid I'll leave my spouse.
That's a great question, Scott. And I think a real, concern, but at the same time, like, think about what we're saying here is if someone's unhappy, certainly I'm an advocate for taking steps to find themselves in a happier place. And that might be if you are recognizing that you're having some sort of complication in your relationship, maybe you finally take the initiative to approach your spouse or your partner or whatever it is and say, hey, we need to really work on this. Here's what I'm thinking. Maybe we can go to therapy. Maybe we can talk more about this. It helps to facilitate, I think psilocybin helps to facilitate a little bit more communication and conversation with people. And that doesn't mean that your spouse has to do psilocybin with you, but it may give you the courage to say, I am not taking this anymore until we have to make a change and figure out what that looks like so that we're both happy, and ultimately that may lead to leaving your spouse, but it may be the right solution because yes, I know we have this situation where we all want to stay together for the children or whatever, but at the same time, are we really doing the children a service if there's volatility in the household constantly and the other person isn't willing to work on themselves? Probably not. We're probably doing them a disservice. I mean, we're probably doing them a disservice if we stay in that problematic relationship, especially if the other person isn't willing to work on it. What I like to think of psilocybin as is a tool to help you kind of engage with a type of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. So, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is a tool used in therapy, or you can do it on your own, where you are thinking about your belief systems and then deciding, are they really serving me? I have these negative beliefs about myself. Are they really true beliefs? And how can I change those? So an example of this would be, so again, I'm caring for aging parents, and at first, before I did my psilocybin journey, I was really extremely stressed out I was just always anxious all the time about knowing so much about their health, and like I'm fearing their deaths, and I had this like negative belief in my brain that eventually they'll die and then I'll never be okay again. Like my life will just be this dark black hole of grief forever. That's what this weird belief in my brain was. And it's understandable how we get there, but I had to sit and acknowledge to myself that that's not really true. It's hard to do with just normal CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, because you're still going to have that negative belief. You have to challenge it with your brain over time. And you can do that without psilocybin. But I can tell you that psilocybin changed everything for me and completely changed my life in this area. So I'll just kind of give you that example. So I had many experiences in my first journey with this guide and his mom. But what came up for me was this moment during my journey that really stands out, in that I had to sort of face that belief head on. And at first, I felt really nervous about facing that belief during my trip. As it came up for me, I was like, oh, I don't want to think about this. I sat with it because I had no other choice. Psilocybin was making me sit with it. And what it showed me essentially is that, hey, let's rethink this belief because it's not really true, right? You have been through challenging things in the past. Yes, this will be very difficult when your parents pass on, but you will get through it. So that B, I have a really good support system in my life, and I'm feeling that. I'm feeling very supported. I'm not going to just go walk through this difficult time alone. I'll have people to help me navigate that. And then 3, just in general, like, you're not this weak person. You've been through some challenging things, and you are a strong individual, and you've always found your way. And before, I couldn't make that work in my mind, but psilocybin made it work for me. And on the other side of that journey, as I was kind of coming down from my trip, I had the most peace and euphoria that I've ever felt in my whole life as part of that. And so nowadays, when I'm just in my normal state of consciousness and things come up with my parents' health, yes, I get stressed out still. I still get anxious, but I can remind myself very easily. I can think back to that journey, and I can really center myself and calm myself and tap back into that like power that the psilocybin gave me. So I don't want people to think about it as a way of like, oh, psilocybin is going to blow up your life for the worst. It might help you make some really good changes within your mind, that help facilitate change in your life that actually makes you happier. Because I have been immensely happy ever since. I mean, obviously, I have life stressors and whatnot that crop up, but that journey is something I completely always go back to when I'm having a moment in my life, and it helps me.
And Jennifer, don't we all deserve that in life?
We do,
We
yes.
really do. One final thought that I would just love to hear your spin on goes as to a consistent theme that comes up over and over in the literature, on this show, uh, in conversations with people on the street regarding psilocybin, that sense of connection that it can bring with with nature, with those in your life, whether they're alive or in some cases, as happened with mine, they've passed on to another realm, and with your family and with yourself. And what I can't help but think about is that, in a way, I'm not a mom either, but I can't help but imagine part of the stress, the beauty, and the metaphorical power of motherhood as stemming from is it as a nexus for profound connection. The connection of the mother to the child, the connection of the mother to the child's future, the connection of the mother to all of the members in the family, the connection of the mother to socialization, the connection of the mother to other mothers. If psilocybin can connect people who might be stressed by all of this connection and all of this responsibility more deeply to themselves, we all do deserve that.
We do. Yeah. I just got chills and like tears in my eyes a little bit while you were talking because it's such a beautiful thing that you're talking about. And there is this sense of connection that psychedelics can foster. And I don't think people are as aware of it as they could be. And so I love this concept. There is a concept called oceanic boundlessness that's talked about in psychedelic literature. And it's actually like a concept that predates psychedelic or our discussions about psychedelics, but it came out of a conversation or correspondence between a French mystic, I forget his name, communicating with Sigmund Freud. And so they were communicating and they came up with this idea of oceanic boundlessness, which is really to describe a mystical experience in general, often through religious states or whatever it might be. But that connection to the universe at large, to nature, to other people can really be a very mystical experience. So the psychedelic researchers have started to use that term to describe that connection that you might feel when you're on a psychedelic. And I can describe it for myself. It's different for people, for everyone, and the visual that they have or whatever it is. But for me, during one of my first psychedelic sessions, I was lying down on a mat with a mask over my face to block out the light, and there was Tibetan singing bowls being played around me. It was really quite beautiful. And one of the earliest sensations that I had was this feeling of being connected by threads of light to everyone that I know and love and who I know loves me back. And it was, again, I wasn't seeing a hallucination or anything. It was just the sensation is what I was feeling. And it was really profound because I felt so supported in that moment. And a lot of times we know we have a support system out there. We know we have our friends and family, and we're like, yeah, they'll step in if we've got a problem or whatever. But to really feel that support system in your body the way that I did was incredibly profound. And I've carried that with me ever since. So when I'm struggling in life or whatever, I can just sort of tap back into that feeling of like, I've got all these people holding me up with threads of light, and I'm holding them up too. And one of the things you were just talking about that brought me tears is thinking about my mom, right? She's like my absolute best friend. We talk all the time for like hours on the phone. It actually gets in the way of my work, but I love it because I just absolutely adore her. And I've always felt connected to her, but I actually feel like her supporting me in my body now, which is like a wildly profound thing. And I think it would go the opposite way. And my mom doesn't use psychedelics, but if she did, I imagine she would feel that too. And what a profound thing between a mother and a daughter to just really feel that connection and support carrying you through your life. I'll stop now before I start crying,
I'm
actually, for
about to
real.
start crying too. So I will go into a different mode and talk, but talk from the heart. Psilocybin is known, as we've been discussing for the past few minutes, for triggering this sense of connection. But I realized as you were talking that it's triggered connection in a different way too. Because simply by talking about psilocybin, hearing you share your stories that it brought into your life, I feel deeply connected to you. And I I thank you. And the beautiful thing about that is on the subject of these radiating threads of connection, I also can feel that those who are watching this or listening are going to be affected by that sense of connection To you too, as well as to others who can benefit from this. What an incredible gift that's been. You've given me so much to ponder over, but to feel. And to me, that's the beauty, by the way, of podcasting about this topic. It allows you to think, it allows your mind to expand, but it allows you to feel the practical steps that you suggested, though, that people take when looking at who a facilitator or guide or whatever might be, if you choose to explore this path, is one thing that just really was put in capsule, clear, concrete form that I will be able to remember in a way that I don't think I've been able to absorb from any of the other guests that we've had on this show, although all of them have been amazing, I have to say. Just right in that particular area, you really hit the nail on the head, and that is something that will stick with me for a long time afterwards, not to mention all of the stories that you shared, just amazing. If there is one thing that you wanted to underscore that we've talked about so far, or something, Jennifer, that you didn't get a chance to say but you wanted to, what might that be?
Absolutely. Great question, Scott. Yeah. So I think just going back to this idea of that connection, I think one thing that I love to share with people is how it changed my own relationship with my husband. Because you brought up the idea of like,
Yeah.
people separating or whatever, and we weren't in that space at all. But I've always known I love my husband, like obviously, right? But I went off and did my journey, and then had that sensation of feeling connected. And, he was just at home, like probably sitting on the front porch drinking a beer the whole time, right? Like, he didn't change at all, right? I went off, I changed something within me. I came back and I was like, I really like this guy that I've been married to for 10 years. Like, love this guy. Like,
Oh,
I mean, obviously I did before, but it was like a heightened sensation of love. And I think it changed my relationship for the better. And again, he didn't take psychedelics, he didn't do any of that. And it's not that he's not willing to work on himself, of course he is, but it was something that I had to change for myself because I was putting up walls, I think, in my relationship. And those walls came crashing down. I describe it in the book as like if you remember the 80s, 90s commercials, the Kool-Aid man crashing through the wall, like
I
going,
love that.
oh yeah. It was like psilocybin really did that for me. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention that we didn't get to kind of finish the conversation on trauma and triggers.
Yeah.
When you are in a psychedelic journey, like a therapeutic session or something like that, you might sense that trauma's coming up for you, and that can be really scary in the moment.
Mm.
And so I just wanted to make people aware of that because what's going on there is your natural resistance is going to come up. And that's normal because when we are in a normal state of consciousness in our everyday lives, if you've had an experience of trauma and you have to think about that trauma, you're going to resist doing that because it's triggering for you. It brings up a lot of fear and anxiety, and it's a natural thing that we do. When you're on a psychedelic, there's actually this thing called fear extinction that happens. It's a concept. And what is happening is you're not going to have the same fear or triggers or anxiety in response to thinking about your triggers that you would normally have in a normal state of consciousness. And this is why psychedelics allow you to work on your trauma, reprocess your trauma in a new way, and then come out the other side having a better understanding of your trauma and how to resolve it in certain ways. But again, that resistance might come up initially when something comes at you during a psychedelic journey. If you can remind yourself to not resist and to keep a very open mind, to sit with it, maybe take some deep breaths, that kind of
Mm.
thing, generally, even when those difficult things come up, on the other side of it is that peace and euphoria that I was talking about and a newer understanding. That doesn't mean that a journey can't sometimes be really difficult, but if you just try to resist the idea to resist, that's the way to put it, you will be better off generally. And again, that's what happened for me when the psilocybin was essentially wanting me to think about the idea of like my parents' deaths, right? I didn't want to think about it. And
Yeah.
I had to sit with it. And on the other side, I felt better. So just try not to resist when those types of things come up, and you'll have probably a benefit at the end.
That's really important advice. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. before we close out, you've referenced your book a few times, so why don't you tell us a little bit more about that, and then explain what other things you have going on and exactly where folks can find out more about you. And by the way, we have that some of that information, at least, in the caption or the show notes below the episode itself. So if you don't have a pen or pencil right now available to write this stuff down, you'll still just be able to look and press a link. But tell us.
So yeah, so I have this psilocybin handbook for women. I was like putting it in your window. The psilocybin handbook for women is out. It's been out since 2023, available anywhere books are sold. The book covers the intersection of psychedelics and how they can help with women's health, or for people assigned female at birth. So it covers things like how psilocybin may affect the menstrual cycle, and where you are in the menstrual cycle can affect how your journey goes, which is kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
So I dig into that. I cover the intersection of psilocybin and how it can potentially be beneficial for getting you through perimenopause and menopause, that sort of thing. I have a whole parenting chapter. I have a whole chapter on safety and consent, which is really important. Let's see what else is in there. Lots of things. There's some personal stories from me. There's personal stories from other women who I interviewed and there's some indigenous wisdom in there that's really important to bring into the conversation. And there's one chapter that goes like condition by condition of conditions that typically affect people assigned female at birth, and how psilocybin may be able to help. Like, what do we know about the research so far? I'm a journalist, a medical science and medical journalist, and I'm also a fact checker. Everything I put in here is rooted in science. I tell you the basics of the studies and all of that so that you can understand that in an easy to understand way. So that's the book in a nutshell. You can find me on social media, I'm on all the platforms, and you can find me there as at Jen Chesak. That's JenChesak. I'm happy to answer your DMs if you DM me. You can also just find me online. My website is jenniferchesak.com, and my journalism work is always published there. Upcoming, I do have a book in the works.
Wow.
I don't want to say much about it. We'll definitely cover plant medicine and that intersection of women's health. So I've got that in the works yet, but it's still top secret.
Wow. That's cruel. Words. But nonetheless, all that means is that people are going to have to start following you right now. So
yeah,
as the secrets become unveiled, they will be the first to witness what is to come. And I am very, very excited about doing that. Jennifer, thank you again for being here on the Webdelics podcast. This was a phenomenal conversation.
Thank you so much, Scott. It was a pleasure to join you for Webdelics. What a great organization you got going.
Appreciate you. For those of you who enjoyed this interview, be sure to press the thumbs up button below or subscribe to this channel either on YouTube or on your favorite audio platform. If you're on an audio platform, please also leave us a 5-star review. And if you are on YouTube, make sure that you leave a comment beneath the video, because we want to hear from you. We want to connect and know what you're thinking about. Once you've done all of that, make sure that you go to our other social media platforms and check us out there. We always have interesting new content coming out. And then once you have followed us everywhere that you can think of, go to our website at webdelics.com. That's webdelics.com. Subscribe to our blog for up-to-date, scientifically vetted, credible information on plant medicine and psychedelics. And then be sure to come back next time for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.